Session that will go on until 4:30. There are 4 papers. They are very fresh, low-tech, but by young scholars. One other missing person in this conference is Roger Parker, but 2 of the presenters this afternoon are students of Roger Parker, so we can see the offspring of this very lively, important school in Verdi studies. The first one is Francesca Vella, who studied at the Università di Firenze and then at the Music School of Fiesole, and is completing her graduate work at the King's College with Parker and Emanuele Zenici. She studied that crucial moment in Verdi's reception, that is the years leading to and immediately following the unification. So please welcome Francesca.
Verdi'S Boccanegra e Milan 1781, Esposizione Nazionale Industriale. The opera's premiere at La Scala in March 1881 and the forthcoming Urban Showcase between May and November of Italy's quest for progress and modernization could be addressed from a variety of perspectives. In an earlier paper, I looked at how these 2 distinct, yet in many ways overlapping types of staging were written about in the daily periodical press of Milan. I've examined some aspects of the rhetoric and narrative concerns that characterize both accounts of the exhibition and reviews of the Boccanegra production. Both types of material suggested rely extensively on a language of museality and display, a language that betrays attempts to adumbrate progress and the new by unearthing and increasingly textualizing the national past. Although today I'd like to take the opportunity to start off from these conclusions and develop them into new directions, once perhaps less pertinent to a discussion of disposizione than to past and present operatic debates, a few general considerations will help introduce my specific concerns in this paper. One aspect that characterized both discourse about the exhibition and discussions of opera in Milan that year was the ubiquitous presence of the past in the form of memories sparked off by the objects, musical and otherwise, on display throughout the season. Challenging any preconceived assumption about the clashing temporal categories conjured up by museums and industrial exhibitions, the Esposizione Modern Show was in fact often described in a museum-like fashion. A large part of its fetishes consisted of time-worn articles, precious relics assembled into a museum of rarities and invaluable curiosities, as one critic dubbed it. Similarly, operas such as Humanities, Boccanegra, Don Giovanni, and Voltaire's revised Mefistofele, all staged at La Scala at some point between January and May this year, called for more or less detailed excavations into their compositional and performance histories. The multiple temporal frames to which Verdi's revised Boccanegra gesture, for instance, through its medieval plot and through the magnetism exerted by reminiscences of the early 1857 version, gave rise to startling star-system fusions. References to the original version of the opera and the debate that has surrounded it were the norm in many 1881 reports. Someone even reprinted his own 1857 review. While memories of the 1859 Milanese premiere also surfaced on various occasions. What's more, the deluge of historical awareness from various critics was such that it came to be reflected, unusually for Italian opera criticism at the time, in the typographical layout of the page. Several aspects of Verdi's opera, such as the libretto and the music, Piave's text and Voltaire's amendments, the composer's 1857 work and its recent updating, or even the revised opera and its contemporary performance. All of these were discussed separately, sometimes in distinct columns introduced by distinct headings. It is on these strangely prominent lines of separation, on this language, even politics, if you will, of order and exclusion, that I would like to focus today. Some of these newly pronounced, newly distinct contours taken on by single components of an operatic text or by single opera performances suggest a sense in which operatic compositions, whether the works themselves or their varied, always ephemeral stage reenactments, were at this period becoming increasingly scrutinized, hardening into landmarks on the map of Italy's musical progress. In other words, the level of analytical and historical detail into which critical reviews often went, both on the occasion of the Boccanegra premiere and following other performances in Milan in 1881, might point to a more general need to constitute and narrate the past in order to make the present stand out in a distinct and more prominent position. A concern with time lay behind the encyclopedic urge and the orderly compilation of information disclosed by these reviews, an anxiety similar, in fact, to that elicited by the carefully organized arrays of objects in the locales of the Exposition. There is one particular distinction in those opera reviews that interests me especially here, that between the work and its performance or performances. As just mentioned, a couple of articles about the 1881 Boccanegra made this separation particularly obvious. Both Filippo Filippi, writing for La Perseveranza, and the critic of Il Corriere della Sera executed remarkable distillations of operatic meaning, addressing, as they did, the revised opera and its debut alla Scala in separate sections of their articles. And this is example number 1 in the layout, which is not very readable, but I think gives you an idea of the layout of the article. More interesting still, the second critic conceived this piece before the actual performance took place. The short sections he insists on devoting to the interpreti di stasera and to l'allestimento scenico, both coming after lengthy accounts of various aspects of Verdi's work and its previous stagings, are thus all the more remarkable for their clearly conceived, if circumscribed, presence. Of course, neither Filippi nor his colleague were setting forth any groundbreaking new concept. The operatic repertory had by the time become established firmly enough, even in latecomer Italy, to account for ever more frequent distinctions between musical objects and their performances. This appeared to be the case in particular when a well-known opera was revived on a modern stage. As one critic commented in 1881, following La Scala's much-awaited revival of Hernani, quote, "If one wants to write an appendix in 1881 about a very well-known opera such as Hernani, the last thing one can talk about is the opera itself," unquote. The implication was, quite obviously, that reviews of this kind would usually skip over commenting on the works, either the libretto or the music, and focus almost entirely on the musical performance and staging. On other occasions, past productions were admitted to provide material for renewed discussion, with the extreme which when pseudo-bibliographical details of dates and casts of the work's earlier stagings flooded the page, as happened after the 1881 revival of Hernani. Similarly selective attitudes, that is, ones discriminating between the work and its performance, were directed towards operas that had undergone significant revision, such as Boccanegra or Mefistofele. In these cases, the literary and musical-dramatic texts were frequently discussed, often in counterpoint with memories of their earlier versions. Yet, the actual musical performance retained a prominent position in the reviews, above all once separated from discussion of the music itself. You would see then that the relationship between operatic works and the performances was, in late 19th century Italy, one of increasing dissociation, at least according to the manner in which this issue played out in contemporary reports of opera performances. Of course, critics finding themselves having to review brand new works, such as Ponchielli's Il Figlio Prodigo, which opened La Scala's 1881 Carnival season, would lag somewhat behind in the articulation of this divide. Remarks about the music could still be quite tightly enmeshed with comments on singers and audience response, in statements that often read more or less like the following, taken from a review of Il Figlio Prodigo published in Pollock. And this is example number 2. Quote, "The pure, solemn grandiosity of the chorus that introduces Act 1, and the warmth, the passion, the impetus of that act's finale have the quality of those great beauties that are immediately grasped, and the fascinatio, dominatio, make you leap up, just as the audience did last night, when the overpowerful voice of Tamagno, his warm, passionate accent, his effective acting, gave the limpid dominant voice of this finale all its splendor, or when, in the introduction, the mellow, easy, velvet voice of Dangieri and her beautiful singing contributed to emphasize the grand serenity of that piece. In these cases, it would be easy to claim that it would take a time of reiterated listening of and extended exposure to the composer's work for those 19th century journalists to come to relinquish their jumbled attitudes to elements pertaining to the work and elements belonging to the performance. I wonder, though, whether our teleological narrative of the 19th century's burgeoning distinction between lasting operatic texts and transitory, always varied revisitation through performance could to some extent be complicated. We could perhaps take into account other types of documents beside opera reviews, and ask what these 19th century explorations of the seemingly opposite status of operatic compositions and their performances can tell us about contemporary attitude to time. It is to this end that I would now like to turn for a brief look at the so-called disposizioni sceniche. These 19th century documents have aroused a good deal of scholarly debate in the last few years. Their function, as well as that of their French ancestors, the Verdi mise en scène, has been variously discussed by different scholars and for different specimens of these materials. It is generally held to oscillate between providing a record of an opera's first performance, an account that more precisely also includes elements of that event's interpretation or reception by the compiler of the disposizione, and furnishing instructions of varying prescriptive force for subsequent productions. I don't have time to go into any thorough examination of these documents, nor of the literature they have prompted, but I would like to linger on a few passages from the recorded disposizione scenica for Simon Boccanegra, passages that might offer us a glimpse of how the apparently straightforward late 19th century divide between works, that is, durable items, and performances, ephemeral events, could be problematized. There is a sense, of course, in which the later disposizioni sceniche published by Ricordi, such as this one before Simon Boccanegra, or the even more elaborate ones from Mefistofele and Otello, point to an increasing integration of aspects, mostly visual, of the staging, into the lasting authorial texts. These documents, that is, were conceived as complements to the libretto and the score, the authority of which had by the 1870s or 80s become, not least through Verdi's gravitas, more or less generally accepted. The imperiously prescriptive tone of the late 19th century Italian staging manuals indeed seems to point, as James Hepakolsky has noted, quoting Verdi, to the belief that there existed only one correct interpretation of any given work of art, and that the disposizione, overseen by, if not bearing the signature of the composer or librettist, would disclose it. In other words, if we take interpretation to include the staging of an opera, then the latter was becoming read into the text on which rested the durability and possibility of future reenactment of the work. But we could be even bolder than this. We could argue that an event, the opera's first performance, was being made into a text in order to allow for and guarantee that event's reproducibility. This strategy betrayed a somewhat surprising belief in an age famously concerned with ideas of progress and change, that not only works but also aspects of their performance could be preserved through time, that in spite of evolving technologies and fickle operatic practices, future spaces of experience and horizons of expectation could continue to match present ones. There is another way, though, in which elements of performance creep into the lines of these later disposizioni sceniche. Whenever these manuals, and thus also the works they need to represent, speak of the raw dependence on stage events, or invoke the unpredictability of this phenomena. In some cases, this is accomplished through those famous blunt appellations, perhaps especially prevalent in the later Verdi documents, to the singer's role in achieving a correct interpretation of the music, both vocally and dramatically. The passage that closes Act 1 in the Disposizione for Boccanegra, and that comes after minute description, in fact prescription, of the council chamber scene, is a famous case in point. Here is the passage in question, and this is example number 3. A simple reading of this scene will give an idea of its importance, but the dry description of a gesture, of a step forwards or backwards, cannot render effective the dramatic development, the succession of episodes and terrible passions that take place on stage. The above directions only denote in a summary way the various physical positions that characters and crowds must take for musical or dramatic reasons. The scene between the Doge and Paolo, however, will live up to its intended interpretation only if two actors of superior intelligence know how to extract both its musical and dramatic concepts, and thus achieve the aim of gripping and moving the spectator. In these instances, the dispositional rhetoric of power and all-pervading authorial control is enacted exactly through the act of entrusting part of that command to the performance, as well as through the acknowledgement and enshrinement of the contingent quality of the performance event. In other cases, it is the very attempt to coordinate precisely the visual, musical, spoken, and, so to speak, psychological utterances that gesture to the ephemerality of, and ultimately to the limits of authorial determination of live stage events. Sometimes it is the redundancy of such cues, the dissipation into lengthy diachronic description of what in performance unfolds synchronically in just a few fleeting moments, that makes the events resistant to translation into text manifest. This is the case, for instance, in Boccanegra's Curse on Paolo at the end of Act 1. The passage for the Disposizione reads as follows, and is example number 4. The Doge cries out in a frightening manner, "Sia maledetto." Then suddenly, with his left hand, he grabs Paolo's right arm, and with his right hand stretched out towards him, straight away darkly adds a command, e tu ripeti il giuro. Paolo is almost stricken dead by this anathema. His face denotes the greatest pride. He would like to refuse, but subjugated by the Doge's eyes, frees himself and takes a step forwards, tremblingly crying out, "Sia maledetto." He then instantly covers his face with his hands, whispering, "Orrore, orrore." The attempt to both compress and convey in full the irreducible and irreproducible thickness of live stage human expression leads to the description of a sequence of actions and moods that, in a sense, can only further expose the gap existing between the authority sanctioned text and its actual stage enactment. At other times, the stage manual quite simply submits to the aleatoric pace of what will be always different stage events, mixing its voice of authority with mild respect at those variables brought about by performance. The Disposizione arranges all remaining stage action around these inconstant elements. At the very end of Verdi's opera, for instance, it is the unpredictable durée of the curtain close, expressing the manual as "the curtain falls slowly," that dictates the amount of time during which both characters and crowds will have to, quote, maintain the utmost stillness. Not the composer's score, that is, in which no exact cues are given for the curtain at this point, but the performance is given a normative role. In all these instances, then, the event performance retains both its own ontological distinctiveness and an intrinsic regulative function within the textualized account of the same event provided by the stage manual. The situation is in many ways quite different with the earlier disposizioni sceniche, such as that for Bal in Maschera, or the even earlier French manuals. These documents bear fewer hints of the changeable actuality of the stage event. Far from seeking to engage with and master its many possible variables, they read more like detached descriptions, mostly visual chronicles of a given production. Their claim for the reproducible quality of once and for all approved stage action is more hushed. The friction between live unfolding of events, ever lurking in the ways just mentioned, and steady reenactable scripts, somehow less pronounced. I wonder what is commingling in the later disposizioni of durability and volatility, of intended textualization and lurking eventuality, of, ultimately, elements of work and elements of performance can tell us. It could perhaps direct us towards new ways of approaching that work-performance distinction that seem to have become increasingly clear for late 19th century Italian critics. It could, in the process, also encourage us to apply further interpretative pressure to our readings of opera criticism from the period. Rather than see operatic works and performances as traveling in 19th century understandings on increasingly divergent routes, ones leading to posterity targeted museum preservation on the one hand, and to unrelenting oblivion on the other, we could reconsider the extent to which actual performances might too, on occasion, have aroused fantasies of sturdiness and incorruptibility. Though none of those events were ever to be replicated, their vanishing quality was ever more frequently put down in tango system accounts. Those performances too, as composers' masterpieces, became monumental markers in the highway of Italy's musical journey. Indeed, our present-day exhumation of the impressions such productions made on their bygone audiences can make them still serve no less than the works that originated them as open doors onto the past. And this is in accord with 19th century views that also increasingly executed the spell exerted by historical materials. In this sense, the age's musical concerns were not far off from perceptions pertaining to other fields. Accordingly, with Edmondo de Amici's 1880 classic depiction of Turin, operatic performances and compositions would too, like each single corner of that city, continue to speak, narrate, hint, and shout. Thank you.
How do we deal with that in terms? I mean, you addressed this slightly, but in terms of we were talking about the critical editions. So maybe you want to expand a little bit on that.
Sorry, the critical editions.
The disposizioni sceniche, stage manuals.
Yes. Sorry, what was the question?
Whether you think it should be part of a discourse on critical editions, or if it reflects a specific historical context.
Okay. I don't think I wanted to say anything about really whether directions or indications there are in the stage manual should or should not be included in the critical editions of Verdi's works. I think I'm just interested in asking whether what these manuals can tell us about this relationship between work and performances, and whether we could read them in such a way that can problematize this distinction.
Yes.
Toward the very interesting paper, thank you. Toward the end, you spoke of the publication of these very detailed disposizioni sceniche as an attempt to render the work permanent and incorruptible. Do I detect in that a fear of corruption, a fear of the future?
I think, I just threw in this question of whether we could, I don't think I really wanted to draw this conclusion from my reading of the Disposizioni Sceniche, which certainly needs to be developed further. But I think what opera critics at the time became increasingly concerned with, I think, was not only like reconstructing or the history of musical works or operatic works, but also providing accounts of and information about actual performances. So both, I think, operatic works and performances became somehow tools for looking back at the past and also reconstructing, seeing a narrative of progress, of musical progress in Italy throughout the decades.
That the Disposizione Scenica for Boccanegra was written in 1881, no? So it's after the Bali Maschera, sure, and other Disposizioni
I think actually the timbro is 1893.
1893,
Yeah.
that's right. And you know, just in this, I'm thinking about your example, there are many indications about acting. And you know that before this date, Verdi met, not directly, but we watched on performances of Salvini and Ristori, were looking for important actors in Italy in the second half of the 19th century. And so, do you think that some kind of information about acting that are entered in this disposizione scenica could be a result of some observation that Verdi interact in himself from the acting of not musical theater but from theatrical theater?
Yes, I think somebody has actually noticed this before. I'm not really familiar with acting from the time, so I can't.
So also only because Verdi it seems asks to singers to be actors.
Yes.
So perhaps I think that it's something that he observed from the staging, for example, from the story.
Yeah, he became increasingly concerned with.
Okay.
Well, if there are no other questions, thank you very much for. I'm going to invite David Rosen now for a brief announcement.
I want to announce a Verdi meeting at Cornell next a week from today. Yes, okay. It's Giuseppe Verdi, a bicentennial study day, Cornell University, from 9:30 a.m. to 5:15 p.m. Speakers include Alessandra Campana, John Davis is a professor of modern Italian history, Charlotte Greenspan, talking about Verdi in film, Francesca Izzo, me, Bill Rothstein, Professor Rothstein, and Marianne Smart. And since I don't have web access, I don't have the actual site, but if you're interested at all in coming, write to me, DBR, that's easy, David, Baruch, Rosen, or Barak, or if you like. DBR2 at cornell.edu, and I'll help with login and stuff like that if you're interested. Just write to me if you're interested. I'll give you the stuff. Thank you.
We have another low-tech presentation for which you will need handouts. If you don't have a handout for the presentation, please raise your hand and hopefully are there extra copies?
Yes, at the entrance.
Okay, great. So here is Davide Ceriani, who also studied at the University of Florence as an undergraduate, and at Bologna as a performer. You performed professionally as a saxophone.
Like in Italy, yes. Here, not so much.
A good thing to do. And then went to Harvard, graduated, had a PhD there, and for 2 years he was a Mellon Fellow at Columbia here in New York. And now he's assistant professor at Rowan, has been working on issues of identity, nationalism, and opera during the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And in fact, his presentation today is about immigration. The title is Asserting Identity, Defying Stereotypes, the reception of the operas in New York at the height of Italian migration to opera 1908, 1915. We need a long breath.
It was even longer.
It was even longer.
Hey, thank you. That's for later. So, the scholarly literature on Italian culture and identity in New York City during the period of mass migration, approximately from early 1880s until the mid-1920s, is mainly restricted to the fields of sociology and history. Even though some scholarly works do exist in the field of music, and particularly in opera, almost none of them discusses the social and cultural impact that composers such as Giuseppe Verdi and Giacomo Puccini, just to name a few, had on the New York's Italian community. The paper I present today is part of a larger project that investigates this subject. In particular, I focus on the reception of Verdi's operas in New York between 1908 and 1915. I chose this time frame because it coincides with both the height of the Italian migration to the United States and with the 7-year span when Verdi's operas at the Met were performed by some of the finest Italian-born performers, Caruso and Toscanini among others. My argument is that performances of Verdi's operas in New York during the period were not just a form of elite entertainment for refined upper-class Americans. On the contrary, members of the Italian community attended Aida, Otello, Falstaff, etc., to publicly demonstrate feelings of national pride, show a desire to maintain a strong connection with their homeland, and display feelings of nostalgia. The reviews I introduce prove both how Verdi's works bolstered the self-confidence of the Italian community and how opera helped to combat the stereotypes American society often attached to the Italians. Verdi was a figure of crucial importance for the Italians that lived in New York. On October 12, 1906, for example, a monument dedicated to the maestro was unveiled in Sherman Square between Broadway and West 72nd Street, where it still stands nowadays and where some of you may have gone a few days ago. More than 10,000 people attended that event, and according to newspaper reports, members of the Italian societies marched from Washington Square to Sherman Square. There, a helium balloon lifted a cloth of red, white, and green, the colors of the Italian flag from the monument. Even though other figures had an important place in the collective identity of the Italians living in New York, statues were erected in honor of Giuseppe Garibaldi, Dante Alighieri, Christopher Columbus, Giovanni da Verrazzano, etc. Verdi held a special position because his operas were performed almost every evening and became a fixture of New York cultural life. His music was considered accessible to the point that it was criticized as too simple and refined by most American critics. And the librettos translated into English were purchased by the audience at opera performances, as opposed, for example, to Italian plays, which were performed in the original language with no translation available. Finally, Verdi had died only a few years earlier. He was a figure that in the immigrant's mind belonged to the present rather than to the past, as in the case of, for example, Dante and Columbus. It is clear from many reviews in New York Italian language newspapers that the members of the Italian community considered Verdi not only a figure belonging to their present, but also as a sort of cult object. The first example I would like to discuss is the performance of Aida for the opening night of the 1908-1909 Met season on November 16. The acclaim that this event received in the Italian community speaks well beyond the merits of the performers involved and the work itself, and clarifies how Verdi played a fundamental role in both shaping and defining the identity of the Italian community in New York during the early 20th century. In order to better understand the context of this performance, it is necessary to briefly summarize the events that led to it. In 1908, the Met became a particular source of pride for the Italians living in New York. The Austrian impresario, Henrik Corrier, was asked to resign, and the new Italian general manager, Gatti Casazza, arrived from Milan's Teatro alla Scala to take his place. Gatti Casazza brought the conductor Toscanini with him from La Scala. Gatti Casazza and Toscanini brought many additional performers and assistants with them from La Scala, reinforcing the Italian presence at the Met. Aida, then, turned out to be a veritable triumph for Italy, not only for the outstanding quality of the performance, but also because the majority of those who took part in the production were born in Italy and performed there before moving to the United States. Understandably, both their presence in and influence on the production of this work were met with great enthusiasm from members of the Italian community. A full list of those performers is here in figure 1 on page 1 of your handout. Among the various reviews available in New York's Italian language newspapers on that performance of Aida, the one by Raimondo Canudo, a music critic for the Bollettino della Sera, expresses with great clarity how crucial Verdi's figure was for the identity and pride of the Italians living in the United States. While sitting in the orchestra section of the Met, ready for the performance to begin, Canudo looked up at the 6 plaques located on the upper part of the proscenium arch. And here, here figure 2 is so the image of the Met stage on the first page of your handout. So Canudo noticed that each plaque bore the name of a different composer, and that one was entitled to Verdi. This is how he described what he saw. You can please turn your page 2, and you find the quote from Canudo's article. I raise my eyes. In the Grand Theatre, I see 6 names above the stage. In a place of honor among Wagner, Gounod, Beethoven, Gluck, and Mozart, I read in gold letters, Verdi. An intimate joy makes me feel more than ever proud of being Italian, especially at this moment in which Italian art is garnering such serious affirmation among the cold ladies and businessmen of America. Canudo expressed a sentiment felt strongly within the New York's Italian community at the beginning of the 20th century. The desire to publicly assert their cultural pride in order to achieve social legitimization in their new country. Verdi was an extremely successful symbol to achieve this goal. The front pages of some of the most important Italian newspapers of New York also show how the excitement for the performance turned into a celebratory event. Figures 3 through 5, here on page 2, mention Caruso, Toscanini, and Gatti Casazza, of course. But of course also everybody was aware that Verdi's Aida was the primary reason for this success. There were several reasons, other than ethnic pride, that made it so important for the Italians to celebrate Verdi, and in particular, in this particular instance, Aida's success. As mentioned earlier, the early 20th century was a period of strong discrimination against the Italians. Between 1900 and 1910, more than 2 million people, primarily from southern Italy, settled in the United States, and particularly in New York. Italian immigration to the United States reached its peak during the first decade of the 20th century, with more than 2 million arrivals, as I said. In 1906 and 1907, the 2 years preceding the arrival of Gatti Casazza and Toscanini at the Met, the wave of Italian immigration to the United States reached an unprecedented high of 300,000 arrivals annually. Between 1900 and 1910, the Italian population of New York City more than doubled, increasing from 145,000 to 340,000. Italians quickly became the main target of social anxiety because they arrived in such large numbers and had difficulty integrating with the local population. The same anxiety was translated, albeit on a smaller scale, at the Met. The presence of so many Italians in the production of Aida, not to mention the fact that a large number of them would have stayed throughout that season and possibly even farther, was received with considerable skepticism. Numerous American music critics, including William Henderson, Harry Fink, and Edward Krehbiel, expressed concern that the Met was going through a process of what they called Italianization. For example, in early 1908, Henderson wrote in the New York Sun that, and I quote, "Every sincere lover of operatic art will hope that in the future the Metropolitan Opera House will not be committed to the exclusive direction of an impresario whose ideals are altogether Italian." End of quote. That impresario was, of course, Gatti Casazza. A few weeks later, Krehbiel, in the New York Tribune, expressed a fear that so many Italians coming to the Met from La Scala might lead to a performance monopoly of operas owned by the Milanese musical publisher Ricordi. Krehbiel hoped that, and I quote again, the change in the character of the repertory would not be the result of Italian, or rather Milanese, domination, end of quote. Americans' distress over the presence of so many Italians at the Met was matched by an even stronger expression of cultural pride in New York's Italian community, with Verdi, again, at the core of that narrative. Many performances of Verdi's operas, especially in the early years of Gatti Casazza's management, became an occasion for the Italian language newspapers to glorify the maestro in order to legitimize the Italian culture and the image of Italy in America. An article in the L'Araldo Italiano on a performance of Otello in November 1909, for example, offered extensive details about the exceptional skills of both Toscanini and the Italian choir. However, it also clarified that both of them were in service of a greater end, that is, offering the best service they could to serve as a medium to Verdi's genius. This way, it was possible, and I quote from that article, to fight and win another great battle in America for the most shining and pure Italian art, end of quote. This scheme was almost inevitably repeated in countless reviews I found in Italian language newspapers in the early years of Gatti Casazza's management. Whether it was Toscanini conducted the so-called Envil chorus from Il Trovatore, Caruso singing Un Dì Felice Eterea from Traviata, Scotti singing Cortigiani di Razza Dannata from Rigoletto, it was always clarified that any of the above had to be in service of Verdi's divine inspiration, or music genius, or unmistakable success. If this language was certainly not new among Italian critics who wrote about Verdi in Italy, in the United States those expressions were often associated with bellicose metaphors of the kinds mentioned earlier. Battle, victory, and fight were terms as recurrent as the positive adjectives referred to Verdi's music. Clearly, the struggle to gain legitimization as an ethnic group translated into the critics' language. Verdi was then the object of veneration, but also an object that served as a tool to convince the Americans that, thanks to their cultural and musical achievements, Italians deserved a better reputation than the one they had. I would like to add that the reviews I collected in Italian language newspapers seemed to suggest that it was Otello that best contributed to this struggle for legitimization. There might be several reasons for this, but the comments that appeared in a 1913 review for Il Progresso Italo-Americano offer a possible clue. The article compared Aida to Otello by saying that the former had extremely powerful effects, but also a characteristic, so that was the caratteristico, that was the word used, a set of melodies which, and I quote, conveys to the opera a popular feeling which may be mistaken for vulgarity, end of quote. Aida, in other words, may not have sounded refined enough to those American critics that were strongly in favor of Wagner's opera. Indeed, the following section of this review, this same review, clarified that Otello was a complete artwork because the more balanced relationship between singers and orchestra brought this opera to a higher, more refined level than Aida. The message that this reviewer wanted to send was pretty straightforward. If the popular Verdi was too simple and unrefined for a certain kind of American audience, there was always the late Verdi to satisfy their palate. A Verdi that, in spite of the Wagnerian influences he may have gone through, he was still, and I still quote from the same article, a pure Italian glory. If Verdi's works aroused feelings of national pride, they also provoked intense sentiments of nostalgia. I would like to focus again on Aida here, particularly on the title character's longing for her lost homeland, Ethiopia, at the beginning of Act 3. I argue that this section of the opera can be read as a metaphor for the situation of the Italians living in New York, and that they transfigure the meaning of this opera in order to better reflect their own experiences in that city in the early 20th century. In recent years, a number of scholars have suggested various interpretations of Aida. For example, musicologists Fabrizio della Seta, Karen Hanson, Gilles Devan, and literary scholar Edward Said have demonstrated how Aida's exoticism is articulated in its text, music, and staging. Others, as the historian Paul Robinson, have interpreted the opera as historical, reading the battle between the Ethiopians and the Egyptians as a metaphor for the long struggle between the Italians and their Austrian oppressors during the Risorgimento period. These approaches and many others are discussed in Ralph Lockey's article Aida and 9 Readings of Empire. The performances of Aida in 1908 at the Met, for an audience made up at least in part of Italian immigrants, suggest an additional and to date unexplored reading, in which Aida becomes a symbol of geographic and cultural nostalgia. At the beginning of Act 3, Aida pines for her country, Ethiopia, which she fears she will never see again. This scene evoked great emotion among the Italian audience at the Met. As the journalist for the Bollettino della Sera recounted, and I quote from that article, "When Aida sings, O patria mia, mai più ti rivedrò, O my country, never shall I see you again, Emmy Destin," who was the Aida for that evening, with profound yearning in her voice, created an intense emotional response in the Italian immigrant audience. They were transfixed by that song to the last notes of her sad reminiscence. End of quote. The sad reminiscence about a distant homeland became one of the principal aspects of the opera for Italians, and certainly the major theme for that act. At first, it seems curious that the journalist from the Bollettino della Sera decided to quote the line which Aida mourns the impossibility of returning to her own country, rather than other lines in which she longs to go back to her homeland, or even when she actually decides to flee to Ethiopia. On page 3, I have listed the passages in which Aida sings alone or in a duet at the beginning of Act 3. It will take a few seconds to go through it. Aida's mood shifts 3 times. In the first example, the romanza, she fears never again seeing the green hills and the perfumed shores of her own country. This is the passage quoted by the journalist of the Bollettino della Sera, and his choice of quote is suddenly less curious when we realize this is the sentiment that mirrored the Italian immigrants' longing for their lost land. In the second example, Aida and her father, Amonastro, perform a duet. Amonastro exhorts his daughter to take action against Amneris, Aida's rival, for the love of Radames. He evokes memories of Ethiopia and tells Aida that once she defeats Amneris, Aida and Radames will be able to reign over her lost homeland. Aida, excited by this prospect and overwhelmed by the memories of her own country, sings enthusiastically, "I'll see again the aromatic forest, the cool valleys, our golden temples." Not only does Aida show how much she yearns for Ethiopia, but she also considers returning a viable possibility. Finally, in the third example, Aida lauds the beauty of her homeland and resolves to return there with her beloved Radames. Here, the situation is a clear reversal of what happened in the romanza. Aida does not grieve over the distant homeland that she will never see again. Instead, she imagines her future there with Radames. Aida compares the beauty of Ethiopia to Egypt, her new home forced upon her by her captors, referring to it as a land of grief, questa terra di dolore. Aida's shifting moods mirror the diverse attitudes of the Italians who immigrated to America at the beginning of the 20th century. Although some returned to Italy, a few million made the United States their new home. A few more pieces of information about numbers of migration here on the last page of your handout. So I'm not going to go over them right now, but you can take a look if you wish later. Those who remain in America mourn the loss of their homeland, and opera became a key means of expressing this nostalgia. Aida's line, oh my country, never shall I see you again, brought forth a flood of emotions that these Italians identified with Aida's longing for home. Canudo, the journalist of Bollettino della Sera, had himself immigrated to New York from Italy. He commented on the Aida performance at the Met by focusing on the verses in which the heroine of the opera expresses her nostalgia for home, rather than her resolution to go back to her own country. Aida, the character, and Aida, the opera, epitomize this homesickness in the eyes of Italian immigrants who attended the Met's opening night performance. In conclusion, I believe that in early 20th century America, Verdi served several purposes for the Italian community in New York. Powerful feelings of nostalgia, patriotism, and pride characterized the social attitude of the newly arrived. For the Italians, opera, and Verdi's works in particular, became a mean for channeling feelings of self-legitimization and longing for the distant homeland. Aida, Otello, and many other works from the maestro's repertory represent a wider and far-reaching phenomenon that centers on the symbiotic relationship between Italian opera and the young Italian community of New York. Such a relationship calls for further interdisciplinary investigation that will contribute significantly to a deeper understanding of Italian identity through music during this period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Kind of a tangential question, but the sculpture, the monument in Ceriani Square, I believe there are 4 operas depicted.
What's that?
I believe there are 4 operas depicted on that statue, and I'm wondering why those particular operas were chosen and maybe who chose them, or how that happened.
Okay, I honestly don't know. It's it's something that yeah, I not something that honestly I had not noticed. But what I'm trying to do right now, and they could answer the question in the future, is shift from primary sources like newspaper primary sources, which conveys the history that the large audience would have known with these marching bands gathering toward the statue and describing exactly what happened, to something more insightful. That is, for example, why those operas were chosen, and yeah, again, like some more insights about this choice. In order to do so, what I'm trying to do is go through some letters, I would say, on how this started. So, were the people involved, how this idea first started, because we know that it came to conclusion exactly this day, October 12 in 1906, but yeah, like when the idea started. For sure, there were a lot of people involved with Italian language newspapers. Barsotti, for example, was one of them, that yeah, decided to gather and to raise funds for this monument. Once as I hope, I will be able to find some letters that give some insights, maybe the answer to this question will come up. But honestly, at this stage, I wouldn't really be able to answer. But thank you. That's the way.
I think Caruso was living across the street at the time.
Yeah, Caruso also lived in several parts. But yes, for a certain period, yes, he certainly lived there.
In Tuscany.
Yeah.
I was struck in this quote, quote 1 on your handout, the last line, alle frede ladies and businessmen d'America, which really seems to speak to this really separation of identities between the Italians and the Americans, is that they're using these English words in the middle of this Italian sentence, particularly the choice of businessmen. I wondered if you could say anything about how the Italians if they saw themselves in terms of class or cultural identity as opposed to the Americans?
Sure, yes, absolutely. So, first point, yes, they repeatedly use these terms like these Americans who attended the performance, they cold-hearted, so that this expression went very, very often. Even the other article I mentioned on Otello, yeah, more than once, but again, it's that in that article and many others, they said, how is that possible that you don't really see any sign of emotion in front of these amazing scenes that make us cry? And so it happens that they go on and on this striking difference between the Italian immigrants group and yeah, the people, Americans that primarily financed the Met. So this happened over and over. In terms of how they saw themselves compared to the rest of the Americans. Here there is a bit subtle distinction, because the people who wrote for these newspapers, they were kind of in the middle of the road, so they interacted with, especially those who were music critics, they interacted a lot with the patrons of the Met. Of course, they knew Gatti Casazza, who in turn had an excellent relationship with these American patrons of the Met. But at the same time, they empathized a lot with the Italians. For example, in a couple of cases, I found letters by Gatti Casazza, who was talking to Canudo and to other critics, saying, yes, I'll help you to get in some of these Italians who otherwise wouldn't really be able to afford coming to this to the Met. So the point is, when they wrote these articles, they were clearly talking to a certain audience. That is, the Italians who eventually read this article, because most Americans couldn't really read the Italian. So there was a particular target for these articles, and indeed they tried to make this distinction between the Italians who felt strongly about these operas and the Americans who couldn't, even they want to, much stronger. If you read the letters, and here I'm primarily referring to letters that I found in the archive of the Met Opera, that was really the primary place, primary source of my investigation during the dissertation that I wrote, you find a situation that it's a bit more subtle. So they certainly did not address the Americans, the patrons, the same way they do here. So after all, how did they really feel? Probably they were honest when they talked about here, like emphasizing this divide. At the same time, for political reasons, of course, they also had to play a game with people who attended to the opera, even if they were not part of the Italian community.
Thank you.
There was a question by Harriet.
Well, I was wondering, you touched upon it just now, is the demographics of the Italian-American audience. My understanding is that the vast majority of the immigrants that were rather impoverished Southern Italian immigrants. Is that correct?
Sure.
And they, I mean, they must have attended the opera at great financial sacrifice. You know, at a time when it was particularly it's a snobby place. Yeah.
Yeah, we have, I have a couple of sources to mention. The first is this interview that Canudo himself, when Gatti Casazza arrived in October 1908, it was one of the first questions he asked. So what can you do for our community, given that Conrad, for example, or the other general managers of the Met, as far they didn't seem particularly interested in that, and Gatti Casazza was very clear in making sure that Canudo would convey this message that I'll do anything possible to help Italians. He referred to Canudo asked about Italians. Gatti Casazza answered, not really mentioning the Italians, because he was accused very often of wanting to Italianize a bit, but he mentioned the poorer communities. He said we do what we can to enlarge the community. And indeed, you find, or at least I found two images, one on a newspaper, another on the Musical America, that depict Italians in the Logione, in the family circle, attending in great numbers performances at the Manhattan Opera, and which for a while ran at the same time at the Met, and at the Met. In both cases, the images are very clear, and even the article makes clear they're Italians. In both cases, though, these articles were written by American critics who actually were not too happy on how Italians behave. And so, but this pretty much brings us the question, besides what these critics said. The point is, were they happy that Gatti Casazza made a move and therefore made opera available to a broader, larger audience, or not? Still something that I'm trying to figure out, but for sure Gatti Casazza was hoping, I guess, that as first generation Italians became second generation Italians and more Italian Americans, to say, and of course they increased in their social level, they would perhaps contribute to the finances of the Met. I guess that was pretty much his idea, but the one can only guess that.
I saw David Rosen hand, and another one. We have 2 minutes, so if you are concise, we can hear them both. Okay, let's start from.
I'd like to follow up on that question. the physical configuration of the old Met had the orchestra level standees all the way down the auditorium to the beginnings of the orchestra pit. Is there anything in the journalism that you've researched that indicates any kind of interplay between the standees and the people in the orchestra seats, or just on an observational level, are they watching these rich people close up and responding to that?
The answer is yes, but in the sense that I have an image which fortunately I didn't bring it with me today, and it's really amazing how there are like 4 different levels, okay? And at the bottom level there are kind of people extremely well dressed, informally talking to each other during a performance what looks like is Caruso singing. At the upper level, there are people crying in tears and, of course, being very much involved. And the 2 levels in the middle, they're kind of like something like. And so this clearly hints at the fact that more than interaction was a non-interaction between the various levels, and how the idea. Actually, this was an image not from an Italian newspaper. It was from. I remember now the title, but it was certainly not an Italian language newspaper. So yeah, pretty much I think that this is the message that this image wanted to convey. That even though all of them, of course, attended the same performance, but the level of interaction was certainly not strong, quite the contrary, and this probably should have stayed the same as time went on. That's pretty much what I can say. And can email me, I can send you an image. It's actually.
Last question. We have less than a minute for question and answer. So.
Okay. I just wondered about the linguistic question of whether the immigrants, the Southern immigrants, would have understood standard literary Italian. Standard Tuscan operatic style Italian.
Oh, you mean in those?
As opposed to dialetto.
Ah, okay. In terms of like the articles written down, I was kind of standard Italian. Yes, absolutely. Once again, because
no, I mean the libretti.
Oh, the libretti.
Listening in the theater.
Oh, okay. No, I mean the libretti for what I've seen, it was pretty much the standard. I mean, it was the same kind of language that.
No, but you're saying they would have been able to understand it.
The audience.
Coming from Sicily or something like
yes.
that.
Yes. Oh, okay. My guess is yes, because after all, a good number of them had already attended at least some of these operas in Italy. I mean, the point is that opera was really a medium for the Italian unity, at least culturally. So at least some of these people must have attended operas back in Italy. So my guess is that yes, probably they were able to understand the language of the libretti. Maybe not everything, maybe not every possible detail, but I don't even know to what extent it was relevant to them. I think that the main point was actually attend the opera and follow the plot, more or less. I think that's probably yes.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Harriet who also has almost finished her PhD from King's College in London, where she's studying with Roger Parker, and is currently a junior research fellow at Christ Church in Oxford. Has been doing very interesting work on Venice, which you would expect to be a very conservative city, but in fact she's been studying modernism and postmodernism in Venice, so music and theater from futurism to Luigi Nono. And she's going to talk about 1951 Verdi and the cult of posterity.
I just have to apologise in advance for the state of my voice. I've unfortunately used my voice a bit, but bear with me and hopefully it will bear up. Okay. On the 50th anniversary of Giuseppe Verdi's death in January 1951, a series of commemorative days were held in Milan. A few days prior to the main event, on the 27th, a small group gathered at the Casa di Pollock. They descended into the crypt where the composer's corpse lay, to conduct what the press called, quote, a sacred rite. At that moment, the choir of La Scala, assembled beside the crypt, launched into the chorus of Va Pensiero, a number that had increasingly become entwined with the history of the Risorgimento, the 19th century movement for Italian unification. the marble lid of Verdi's tomb was removed to reveal the coffin with its oval glass window positioned over the composer's face. A photographer recorded the scene, the resulting picture reprinted in the local and national press. It was an eerie tableau. The photographic lens pointed down on the crowd peering into the vault and onto the coffin. A gruesome silhouette of the corpse was visible through the glass panel. The crowd were, it was said, immediately struck by how Verdi's face was remarkably untouched by 50 years of death. News reports made much of this miracle. The features remained, quote, intact like that of a saint. The necktie still nestled under the chin. Hair and beard were instantly recognizable. One reporter claimed, quote, indeed, through the glass, the maestro's face, after 50 years of sleep, appeared incorruptible. The beard, moustache, and thick white hair still framed his face, the eyelids lowered, over which death had spared its destroying touch. The suggestion that Verdi wasn't incorruptible had a religious resonance. Incorruptibility is a term applied in the Roman Catholic Church to sacred bodies that show little sign of decay. It had long been a requirement for canonization. The physical remnants then became a monument, even a saintly relic. All the hallmarks of the Verdian celebrations that year were manifest in this moment: the exhumation of the dead, the idea of the incorruptible, reinscribing myth, the exploitation of the media to record for posterity, a local site for a national commemoration. In what follows, I will explore how these and other related aspects played out at the occasion of another exhumation and its recording later that year, the revival of Verdi's Attila at Venice's La Fenice Theatre on the 12th of September. Performed by the orchestra and choir of Milan Radio, with a roll call of illustrious singers, the opera was performed in concert, sponsored by Italian Radio as part of a series of commemorative broadcasts celebrating the anniversary. I want to examine here the rhetoric used to describe the event at Verdi's tomb and the revival of Attila as representative of deep-seated Italian preoccupations in the post-war period, notions of posterity, myth, and historiography. These preoccupations were clustered around three aspects of the Attila revival: the notion of the opera as a classic, Attila's Risorgimento echoes as a vehicle for broader stock-taking, for preserving and rewriting Risorgimento history, and the revival as a media event. I want to suggest that it was the particular culture of post-war crisis that prompted not just a concern with recuperating the past and recording for posterity, but that also reignited an emphasis on reinscribing Risorgimento icons. Attila was Verdi's second opera composed for La Fenice, premiered on the 17th of March 1846. It is set in Aquileia on Adriatic lagoons and near Rome in the mid-5th century. Premiered during the Risorgimento, and with its tale of a resurgent Italy, withstanding invasion and occupation, Attila was viewed by Verdi scholars and critics in 1951 as one of the composer's most patriotic operas. It also had more local resonances of the founding myth of Venice, and of course the context of its premiere. These echoes became the touchstones of the 1951 reception. The Venetian press made much of the opera's autochthonous reverberations, and the national press interpreted Attila as the ultimate manifestation of Italianness and national glory. The performance thus formed part of the general recuperative and revivalist trends of commemoration. Such expanding of the repertoire was interpreted in the initial reception and broader public debate as both fueling and alleviating declarations of opera crisis. On the one hand, revivals were seen as part of the solidified museum culture of operatic practice, an emphasis on the old rather than the new. But on the other hand, they were perceived as a way of keeping interest alive in opera, of giving audiences what they seemingly wanted to hear. Opera by this point may have been perceived as an old genre, but it retained importance as something great from the past that could be held onto in a time of national disillusionment. Entire issues of literary journals that year were devoted to debates on the opera crisis. The language we have encountered in relation to Verdi was applied here too. Was opera dead, its old relics in need of exhumation? Critics deemed the crisis a matter of reception rather than of production. Giorgio Graziosi, for example, claimed that there were always new operas being written, but, quote, the responsibility for the crisis lay with the public. All that the dwindling and aging audiences seemed interested in was, quote, an idolatry of the highly consecrated. Verdi is already a myth, and the aesthetic revaluation of Puccini is already starting. Others claimed, however, that this reliance on the past only made opera more obsolete. One critic claimed that, quote, "In the age of the atomic bomb, of the H-bomb, of jet planes, opera is an insupportable archaeological relic." 19th century spectacles would only be further removed from the present. Graziosi's foremost reason for opera's decline, however, was the increasing hegemony of media such as radio and cinema, something that, as we shall see, had a decisive impact on the 1951 reception of Attila. But if such revivals tended to be of works long forgotten, that didn't prevent them from acquiring classic status. Attila's perpetual contemporaneity was endlessly reinforced, and this reading relied on an understanding of emotion. The opera was seen as inciting intense affective responses in the audience, just as it had done in 1846. The important question for critics was what the affective differences were. The historical exegesis that was a feature of press reports was concerned with describing not just what the opera meant to its author and original audience, but also the comparison this drew with what it meant to the contemporary public. Thus, to borrow Frank Commode's definition of the classic, the revival was all about reinforcing ideals of permanence and change, of recuperation and accommodation to the present. To turn to the second aspect of a concern for posterity, such commemorations form part of a broader focus on the nation's past, a trend intensified by the recent rupture and discontinuity of war and the turmoil of its aftermath. There were two overlapping spheres of commemorative historiography. Within Verdi scholarship, this was a period of writing the composer back into the Risorgimento, of reinscribing myth. And within Risorgimento scholarship, this was a period of rewriting the history of unification in light of recent events. What Lucy Ryle has called the, quote, retrospective shadow of fascism and war prompted a desire for the creation of a new national past, either one that in its heroism and glory showed the last few decades to be an anomaly, or one that instead sought the roots of recent failure in the previous century. This polarized debate was led by the latest publication of an idealized text by Benedetto Croce and a historical materialist text by Antonio Gramsci. Whereas Croce argued that the fascist period had been a parenthesis in the nation's history, Gramsci argued that in fact it had deeper roots in the failures of 19th century unification. Simultaneous with Verdian myth-making then was an acute awareness of the inevitable politicization of such historiographical processes. An article published at the end of the previous year dealt with the increasingly politicized nature of writing on Verdi. The author, Giuseppe Cacciola, claimed that, quote, "We will hear the deafening drumbeat of official culture, the uttering of a cliché that today should be considered with great caution. Verdi as an animator, patriot, and the instigator of powerful revolutionary essays against the brutal oppression by Austria." Cacciola goes on to warn of the, quote, easy patriotic oratory that can be created from Verdi's, quote, Dionysian effects. The critics of Attila did not take heed. They repeatedly noted the sheer depth of emotional response inspired, claiming that the opera's continuing emotional resonance was just as strong as its cultural significance. And this led critics to raise directly the question of Verdi's role in the Risorgimento. Could he be separated from the ensuing fate of liberal Italy, rehabilitated from a Gramscian argument without sliding into Crocian idealism? And could recent appropriations, i.e. fascist, be disentangled from previous narratives? For example, some attempted to universalize Verdi in an attempt to extract his patriotic resonances from more recent history. The famous writer Massimo Bontempelli even waded in, claiming that the difference between Verdi and Wagner lay in the fact that, quote, while the Wagnerian period fully exploded into the world and flourished in German imperialism, which concluded with Nazism, we found in Verdi the fundamental roots of a common humanity beyond races and political borders. Others, conversely, sought to locate Attila's ongoing emotional power precisely in the opera being synonymous with the Risorgimento. Many again took up the phrase of Verdi as the, quote, maestro of the Italian Revolution, the opera as the emotional vehicles of that status. One critic wrote that to understand the success of Attila at its premiere, quote, it is necessary to consider the clear patriotic allusions of the opera. In other words, amid the political unrest as 1848 approached, in response to the opera, quote, Frenetic and uncontrollable cries of passion burst forth from the audience in a delirium of uncontrollable emotion. Verdi was again reinforced as an effective symbol of national progress, of glory and heroism, against notions of backwardness, reaction, and political and emotional oppression. Recent scholarship has uncovered how the image of Verdi as the, quote, bard of the Risorgimento was something that primarily emerged after the event. But what is interesting for our purposes here instead is how the aftermath of war of fascism seemed to reignite an interest in reinforcing this narrative. Numerous texts have been published on Verdi and the Risorgimento over the preceding decade, not least under and often sponsored by the regime. But the commemorations of 1951 prompted an even greater flourishing of scholarship and criticism from both ends of the political spectrum. There were two primary concerns: recuperating and reviving forgotten operas, and then reconstructing their patriotic meaning, regardless of the amount of evidence. Revisionist scholarship has tended to focus on texts from later in the decade, such as Franco Abbiati's four-volume biography of 1959. But much of the patriotic rewriting by these texts, however, stems from the scholarship surrounding the 1951 commemoration. Abbiati's edited volume, Giuseppe Verdi, from 1951, for example, isolates and emphasizes the aspects of Verdi's operas seen as representative of his patriotic zeal, aspects used as evidence in the later text. The operas as universal and Italian, the emphasis on vocal music as inciting communal emotion, the impetuosity of Verdi's style as marking his heroism in the service of La Patria. A rhetoric of post-war crisis, then, was again reinscribing Verdi and Attila as metonyms for Risorgimento politics, the metonymic presence inscribed and instilled in the service of broader historical stocktaking. The third and final aspect I want to consider here is the revival of Attila as a media event. The performance formed part of a commemorative Verdi Cycle on Italian radio. 24 works were transmitted, talks and conversations broadcasted. The exploitation of every available media outlet, telegrams and press releases, newspaper articles, as well as the issuing of commemorative numero unico periodicals, essays, monographs, documents and correspondence, the use of photography and later release of the revival on record, ensured that every aspect of the commemoration was recorded. The focus in the reception, as far as Attila was concerned, was on the issue of radio broadcasting. Declarations of opera crisis, critics noted, despite declarations of an opera crisis, critics noted that the dissemination of opera on radio meant that the genre was reaching a wider demographic than ever before. To put it simply, more people could now listen to more operas more frequently. As one critic noted, quote, "Who would have thought that at the 50th anniversary of Verdi's death, it would have been possible to hear all the works of the maestro from the first to the last, not just in Rome or Milan, but in the provinces." But if every available media network was employed to record the event and to perpetuate the Verdi myth, there was also an undercurrent of anxiety. Concern was centred on the fact that Attila was performed in concert. For a start, the lack of visual clues hindered audience comprehension, especially when no previous production could be brought to mind. Consensus was unequivocal. Performing Attila as an oratorio was only to its detriment. One critic even claimed that, quote, "Presenting Verdi in the form of an oratorio is like admiring in black and white a picture of Tiepolo." The uneasiness of the concert format went deeper still. One critic noted how the audiences were growing used to a new aesthetic experience. Quote, "We are now used to hearing Verdi's operas on the radio. We apprehend them, fully aware that in this form the music seems to be divorced from its natural setting. Using our imagination, we try to complete the broadcast, mentally reconstructing the theatrical backdrop on which the music resounds in the theatre." But, our critic notes, this production was more troublesome. It was actually performed as an oratorio, and thus as if only for radio from the outset, the opera house setting being mere means end to an end. Another critic claimed, quote, "The fact then that Attila was presented in the form of an oratorio does not affect radio listeners, since practically all the works broadcast on radio before the advent of television are in the form of an oratorio." Thus, Attila on radio, in a rather Adorno-esque critique, posed a threat to older modes of opera appreciation, as well as touching on the sense that radio and cinema were hastening opera's demise. And there was a more profound ambivalence. If, on the one hand, older operatic spectacles were judged to be increasingly out of touch with a more austere present, on the other, the doing away with the visual elements altogether in the service of a more modern media was equally problematic. Opera Crisis was seemingly as much about embracing and using new media as it was about rejecting them and their new ways of art appreciation. This, quote, techno-historical event thus simultaneously embodied and blurred the dichotomies of the age, of tradition and invention, history and myth, progress and reaction. Amid the rhetoric of post-war crisis, and particularly of opera crisis, Verdi was thus elevated as a discursive icon, his body an allegory of the national body politic, his operas an allegory of the risorgimento. Attila was made into an incorruptible, just as Verdi's physical corpse had been, both thus rendered so that they could become metonymical symbols of an earlier time. Such modes of history and discourse raise further issues: the role of emotions, of effective reactions to the construction of national icons, of a national past constantly reinforced as local, and of the politicization of commemoration, posterity, and historiography. In a period in which Italy seemed to be losing faith in much of its past, Verdi emerged as a more positive pole for rewriting it, a miraculously preserved emblem capable of endless exhumation. Thank you.
Is there any information on what guided the choice specifically of Attila among the risorgimento operas, not something like Nabucco, for instance, or about Padre Pivagnano?
Yes, okay. I think there was very much preoccupation with, as I say, reviving an opera that, as they say in the reception, that no one could remember having heard before. That was really kind of what they were looking for, and especially when Venice was choosing to have a flagship performance for the festival that year, it also wanted something that could be incorporated into a broader discourse of Venetianness, Venetian classical audience. So that was the main reason.
Yes, in your research, have you discovered any difference in the use of Verdi for clarifying politics between Christian Democrats and communists?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I would say perhaps, yeah, I guess to some extent there is a greater clarity, I would say, here of political divisions, yeah, in the sense that this was something that was equally discussed by a broader spectrum of the press, compared to perhaps things I've looked at before in the rest of my work, where there's one particular party which kind of monopolises the discussion. And so this then serves as a very interesting kind of example of numerous different kind of interpretations. Yes. And also even the sort of way it's presented in the press, particularly with what else is going on that year and the involvement of political figures in the commemorations and the way that that's then played out, because I'm not thinking so much of Attila, but of the celebrations in January 1951, where the president was very involved. And you've got on like the first pages of the newspaper, you've got like a political discussion of what the president was doing that day, and then his role in the Verdi commemorations, all within the same articles, which is then quite interesting. Yeah, that's another question.
We have Marcelo.
What about in terms of class? Was he attached? Was this involved in any way attached with class? Because I know there was a post-war period and there was a poverty problem in Italy, and this was addressed emphatically in the Aurelist film, for example, which had this very Marxist edge. What about was there any connection? Did you find any in your sources?
Yes. Again, yes. I suppose it depends on the political orientation of the person writing it, but yeah, you get some, I mean, there's a lot of sort of biographical rewriting of Verdi at this point, which is sort of emphasizing his origins in a more sort of working class, provincial, rural background. But then you've also got a lot of communist figures, sort of in a more kind of intellectual Marxist tradition, also sort of engaging with him in a completely different way. So again, yeah, I guess it's very multifaceted according to the political orientations of who's doing that.
Thank you.
Oh, well, I think that some reasons about what I was asking you before, we can find looking at the discussion around Verdi's performance in the 10 years before, because there are two historical events important. First of all, in 1940, when it's before the enter of Italy in the war, there was the commemoration of Verdi's centenary in Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei. And it is very interesting that 2 years before, the Academy closed the field of the research. Then in 1940, Mussolini gave as a gift, regalò, a group of letters of Verdi, of correspondence with Verdi Piroli, to the Academy. Then starts again the research, because the research of Luzio was before. And meanwhile, on the Maggio Musicale Fiorentino, there were several kind of performances from set designers which were not in line with the government, but there were also Cipriano Fisiotto, which was a set designer very close to Mussolini. So, and on the end of the Second World War, this one had to rest, to divide. In fact, there are some articles on the press about the fact that Siciliani, who was the director with La Broca on Maggio Musicale Fiorentino, didn't accept the direction of Visconti for La Forza del Destino because it was considered communist. So it's in the correspondence of Siciliani that perhaps the reason of this time we can find there.
Yes, okay, yes. And I would say also in the 1941, they have the big 40th anniversary celebrations as well of Verdi's death. And yes, I mean, I think there's so much more I could say about that. I mean, for the purposes of this, I very much restricted it to kind of like what people were talking about in this very specific context. And what's interesting is they don't refer to anything like that. I mean, they literally go straight back to 1846 and 1901. And but of course, yeah, the 40th anniversary celebrations in particular, I think, are lurking in the back of all of this. But yeah, they didn't have time to put that all in as well.
I also wonder if the representation of Attila has something to do with the way Nazism and fascism was portrayed during those years when they were opening lots of monuments to the partisans and so on. Because it seems like the rhetoric is always like, those were the barbarians, they called them, you know, so I wonder if you found any evidence that Attila was somehow identified with the barbarian, meaning really the Germans.
Yes. Not explicitly enough. I mean, yes, okay, it seems. I mean, there's a whole thing about, kind of occupation and, there is I mean, obviously you can read into it, especially as well, even just with Venetian history and with Austria and that kind of thing, but again, it kind of, really speaks the surface.
We have time for one more question. Okay, well, thank you very much. Our last presenter of this session is Emily Pollock from Portland, Oregon, who is teaching at MIT in Boston, so she needs some technology, a requirement of her institution. And she also studied post-World War II music, but in Germany at Berkeley with Marianne Smart, And but today is presenting on Life Cycle, celebrating Verdi at the Sarasota Opera.
If I could get the, thank you. If I could get the lights turned down just a little bit so we can see the pictures better, that would be great. Thank you so much. Welcome to Verdi's birthday party. These words from a tall and cheerful usher, aged perhaps 75, were a festive way to bring a large crowd into a celebratory space in a properly merry mood. The birthday boy, of course, was unable to attend. The celebration would need to occur without him. But despite Verdi's absence and his historical stature as one of the greatest composers of all time, the tenor of the event was curiously intimate, and the question came to me, was this party an example of a kinder, gentler, more personal monumentality? The event I've just begun to describe took place on the evening of March 24th, earlier this year, in the 1,122-seat Opera House in Sarasota, Florida. And the birthday party itself took the form of a season-ending concert by the vocalists and orchestra of the Sarasota Opera. Earlier that same day, the company had bid farewell to their winter 2013 season with their final performance of Verdi's rarely performed comic opera, Un giorno di regno. The birthday concert featured a large group of performers then that had already spent much of their Sunday in Verdi land. What treats would be on offer for their second performance of the day? Programming for celebration concerts sometimes seems predictable. Think of all of the symphony seasons that end with Beethoven's Ninth, or of the proliferation of rites of spring at every imaginable level of orchestral performance for its 2013 centenary. Based purely on anecdotal knowledge, I can surmise that there was an uptick in performances of Verdi's Requiem in the world's concert halls this year, and that work is hardly a rarity as it is. Sarasota Opera's concert celebrating the 200th anniversary of the birth of Verdi did feature some of the composer's most popular music, Celeste Aida and the Triumphal March, for example, and the Brindisi from La Traviata, some real party music. But the rest of the program does not quite follow a greatest hits model. For example, they played an early version of the Friendship Duet from Don Carlos, and the lengthy and repetitive ballet music, unfortunately devoid of dancers in this performance, from Le Trouvère, that is the French version of Il Trovatore, for which geographical transposition, as we know, required a splendid dance break. Finally, the program included two arias from the company's Verdi opera of the moment, Il giorno di regno, performed here with alternative caballettas that had been discovered by our own Francesco Izzo in the course of researching and preparing the critical edition. As the company's run of Il giorno di regno had been the first performance of the new edition, the concert's presentation of these arias certainly tied in neatly to the season, but these puzzle piece results of musicological sleuthing are arguably strange candidates to represent Verdi's music on the momentous occasion of the composer's 200th anniversary. Program notes for the concert clarify the motivations behind these choices. First, that the cuts Verdi had been forced to make to Don Carlo had been restored in a later production, evidence that he did not intend for their exclusion. And in the second case, that Verdi's abandonment of the notoriously ill-received Il giorno di regno had prevented him from revisiting the score. These caballettas were not merely rare then, but actually qualified as world premieres. Well, that's certainly celebratory enough, the idea that a composer turning 200 could still have a world premiere. In truth, and anyone who is aware of the activities of the Sarasota Opera will know this, the Verdi concert is actually an annual event, and the excavation of Verdi rarities, alternatives, and B-sides is part of these concerts' raison d'etre. No shallow, crowd-pleasing gala these are serious goals. By the 2016 season, in which the Sarasota Opera will expand the company to unprecedented size in order to perform Aida, they will be, according to their website, quote, the only company in the world to have performed every note of music Verdi ever wrote. The annual concerts, such as the installment in March that officially marked the bicentennial, are key because for the company to truly claim every note, they need to not be confined to the stage alone. The ballet music for Le Trouvère was done in concert because of the lack of a full dance company, for example, even though the French version of Il Trovatore was performed in Sarasota back in 2002. Smaller scale works and alternative versions of vocal pieces can be done in anthology-style programs affiliated with the Sarasota Opera, but peripheral to its season programming, which usually presents 4 operas in a festival-style rotation over the course of February and March each year. Since 1989, at least one of those operas has been by Verdi each year, and sometimes 2. This coming season, for example, the company will present not only their Il Trovatore, which they first covered in 1993, but also Jerusalem, the Parisian version of I Lombardi. The Sarasota Opera's commitment to the works of Giuseppe Verdi goes by the moniker, the Verdi Cycle, and I hope that you already have a sense of what an ambitiously completist exercise it is. Since 1989, when the company considers the cycle to officially have begun, with 11 performances of Rigoletto, artistic director Victor Lorenzi has cycled through 29 of the 33 operas they count as canonical, plus the yearly Verdi concert, accounting for at least a quarter of all productions, staged by the company over 25 years. Now, given that, according to the statistics website OperaBase, Verdi is the #1 most performed opera composer worldwide, it may seem that he is not the kind of composer who particularly needs such a champion. If Verdi is, in practice, the most canonically important opera composer, in other words, aren't his works merely stalwarts of the standard repertoire, and a focus on them hardly daring? But Sarasota's commitment to the works of Verdi goes far beyond the top 10 approach to embrace early and rare repertoire. The Verdi Cycle is not exactly about the idea that we're rebalancing the repertoire, though, or even performing pieces that are never or rarely performed elsewhere. It's about the accomplishment as a whole, the accumulation for a city and for a company of a complete and total knowledge of the works of one man whose compositional output is thought worthy of extraordinary attention and long-standing commitment. Consider an example that is similar in scope. In 2006, all 22 of Mozart's operas were done in Salzburg. But that year's commitment, while presumably tapping into a huge supply of artistic and financial resources to execute, is very different in kind from the project that Sarasota has managed over decades, bit by bit, performance by performance, to accumulate. And while a box set of DVDs commemorates that cycle and monumentalizes it for media memory, the cycle performed by the Sarasota Opera is available only in the ephemeral event of the performances itself. While, as I said, one would be hard-pressed to find any American opera company that truly neglected Verdi, the Sarasota Opera has made Verdi the cornerstone of its artistic identity. Nowhere is this more concretized than in the company's marketing materials. And yesterday's presentation on Paratext, I feel like I'm piggybacking a little bit on that. A billboard outside the Opera House proclaims the existence of 3 categories of opera: comedy, tragedy, Verdi. The program booklet for 2013 reproduces Verdi's portrait and advertises the composer's bicentennial. No mention on this cover of the other 3 pieces of repertoire performed in rotation last winter, that is Turandot, The Pearl Fishers, and Of Mice and Men. A recently coined slogan for the company, which claims, again quite intimately, that Sarasota is Verdi's American home, appears on magnets and mugs for sale. And the mugs additionally picture Verdi's face and boast a further logo with all the titles of all 33 projected operas. So this, you can buy this. For those of you that don't already have one, Francesca and I have one. I have it in my office. It's really, it's amazing. You all need them. Francesca has 4, he told me, actually.
They gave me a set.
Yeah, they gave me a set. So this other logo with all of the titles of all of the operas, that's sort of another logo that they use. A Facebook post this week, which concerned a more accurately timed Verdi birthday party taking place in Sarasota, puts a party hat on the master, and then speaks to Verdi in the second person. Your music and legacy live on here at Sarasota Opera, your American home. Very sweet. Lobby banners in the house itself list the current scorecard, as it were, and a new website, which is verdicycle.org, for those of you who are curious, reproduces testimonials and documents all of the company's performances in the project through data and pictures. Advertising copy encourages audiences to, quote, experience a historical music event in the making, end quote, to be part of the process, to be connected to other opera goers past and present through participation in a shared experience, to live 1 year in many of life cycle of Verdi's works. Similar strategies mark the Sarasota Opera's donor opportunities. For example, particularly avid Verdi lovers are called to adopt one of the operas by becoming part of the Verdi 33, pledging a yearly donation until the time of the cycle's completion. And at this point, I believe Alzira, Giovanna d'Arco, and Aroldo are still up for naming rights, in case those are your favorites and you have some extra money. The Verdi Circle of Donors who give on a smaller scale are encouraged to, quote, be a part of the unique undertaking that honors Verdi and allows our audience to experience his complete canon of works, end quote. Though those just tuning in now will not obviously get to experience the entire cycle, which is now almost over, participating in support connects patrons and audience members to a tradition and a project that is purposely bigger and more ambitious than any one typical listener, donor, or artist could undertake individually. In order to give the entire cycle the weight its ambitions command, the company strategically and self-consciously articulates a position of both long-term monumentality and yearly specialization. The cycle is positioned as a lifetime achievement, while the single occasion is an unmissable event. When asked to recount the history of the Verdi Cycle, Richard Russell, the executive director of the Sarasota Opera, whose first affiliation with the company was as an apprentice artist in 1989's Rigoletto, traces the real start of the cycle to the 2 versions of Simone Boccanegra, which were performed in 1992, which launched, as some of you surely remember, with a musicological conference and a new attention to critical performing editions and alternative versions. The brand of the Verdi Cycle, meanwhile, came from the late 1990s. So it really wasn't a conscious effort when we started, Russell says. First, they did Rigoletto with some attention paid to historical performance practice, then followed with Araldo in order to introduce some new literature to the festival audience. At the time, in fact, Verdi's operas like Araldo and Simone Boccanegra were considered to be part of a different series of productions called the Masterworks Revival Series, non-Verdian productions in which included operas such as La Valli and Tchaikovsky's Iolanthe. As Russell describes the Verdi project, the company has grown into the Verdi idiom as a strength, building an audience and a mission not by initial fiat, but by gradual progression and continual determination. While Russell knows of only about 3 people who have seen everything, thousands have seen at least one show making up the Verdi Cycle's global congregation. And according to Director of Audience Development Sam Lowry, Sarasota Opera patrons come from 55 of 63 Florida counties, 46 of the 50 states, and 14 different foreign countries. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Sarasota Opera's Verdi Cycle is its aesthetic uniformity over the years. All of the productions have been cast, prepared, and conducted by Terenzi, who says that what is unique about the Verdi Cycle is that there is a consistency in terms of its visual and musical approach. I've conducted everything. Sarasota has a house aesthetic, which is my aesthetic. In his musical direction, Terenzi considers 3 questions. One is, what did Verdi write? So we know that by the critical edition. The second is, what did he mean to write? And that is, he knows that sometimes mistakes are made. And the third thing, which for me is the most important, which is what people call style, and that's what he meant by what he wrote. Particular stylistic points that Terenzi has emphasized include encouraging the use of portamenti, a liberal ornamentation style, flexibility and balance of accompaniment, clear amplification of the text, use of critical editions, and thinking about original 19th century performance practice as much as possible. His strict stylistic doctrine is ultimately inspired by a sense of service to the composer about whom he cares so deeply. My feeling is that I'm a shadow. I think performers are shadows of the piece. Verdi was great, and we try to find his greatness. Some people do it better than others. Some people do it better than others in certain works. And it's kind of like you look at a shadow, and sometimes you look at a shadow and say, oh my goodness, that's the shadow of a lamp. And sometimes you look and say, that's just a blob. Talking to Terenzi and others in the company, I get the strong impression that the fact that the Verdi Cycle has been so persistent and so consistent over the years is largely due to Terenzi's fervently believed and at times orthodox artistic approach, which drives a sense of mission and keenly felt artistic pride. The consistency in stage and costume design is also astonishing. I've reproduced a number of production photos here that range throughout the cycle. The rental website proudly characterizes the company's design practice as reflective of the composer and librettist's original intent, carefully researched and designed to be faithful to the time period specified by the opera's creators. The staging aesthetic is thus resolutely traditional, realistic, and representational. We don't do concept opera, Terenzi told me. We try to tell the story. Most recently, this visual aesthetic has been executed by Martha Collins, a singer who started in Sarasota working with the Young Artist Program, and who has staged several of the Verdi productions since 2006. She characterizes many modern directors as trying to fix opera through their own concepts without putting trust in the art form. The way opera survives, she says, is by doing quality work that is inspired by the text and the music, not by a concept that is imposed on it that leaves the audience utterly puzzled and mystified. If it's not inspired by the music and the text, it's just a vanity project. She told me that she does research in Italy for each production, visiting historical locations and getting a sense of Verdi's time period and of the era in which the opera is set. In practice, of course, the challenges of the music and the design of the house mean that the ultimate staging is a marriage of faithful research and workaday logistics. Many of the costume and set elements, for example, are successfully reused in multiple productions, and larger shows put extra demands on the house's relatively small stage. One of the themes that came across most strongly in the interviews was the role of the audience in reinforcing the project and cheering it on to completion. Audiences want to feel good, says Terenzi. They want to feel intelligent. They say, I like Rigoletto, so let me see Il Corsaro. The audience kind of became Verdi collectors. Martha Collins has observed that there is an audience here over the years of doing this. There is an audience for these early Verdis. They've come to know what to expect. They've come to know there's a self-improvement or an ego element of, I'm getting to see all the early Verdis I will have seen. And there's some kind of challenge for some people in accepting that and wanting to be able to experience or brag about it. Russell, too, has a similar impression of their audiences. I think the audience specifically for the cycle, we've trained our audience. The people who live here, who are part of our community, recognize what we do and subscribe to it. I wanted to talk today about the company's critical reception as a sort of a counterpoint to this enthusiasm which the Sarasota Opera has for its audience. If only as a good reminder for those of us that do historical reception that critics don't always represent the general feeling of the audience at large. Basically, it seemed to me in reading national reviews of the company over the years that the constructive aspects of their project have been relatively underacknowledged, while biases that characterize the company's design aesthetic as either cheap or outdated seem at times frankly unfair and possibly unkind. But instead, I'd like to conclude by speaking a little bit about what I think a company like Sarasota Opera can teach musicology. Attention to productions and performance in opera studies is growing by the year from many methodological or theoretical angles, and both in contemporary practice and in historical context. Many of the influential scholars in this area have been understandably drawn to directors and productions that are conceptually oriented and present new interpretive angles. Such productions have therefore become enshrined as more scholarly and perhaps even more intelligent. Sarasota Opera's productions, on the other hand, may not give a radical view of Verdi's works, and may at first seem conceptually limited as a result. But in tapping into older traditions of representational staging, the company deploys powerful discourses that privilege ideas of the rare, the authentic, and the exact in a very different, and to me, interesting way compared to the equally contingent discursive priorities of some more revisionist directors. A statement like Terenzi's that, one of my problems with updated performances is you're often left with questions, and I don't think an audience should leave a theater with questions, actually sounds shockingly bold for how it runs counter to many of our currently scholarly perceptions of staging. Perhaps for that reason alone is a useful position to have represented. And I would argue, too, that it is exactly because the more modern directors think of conservative productions as a foil that we should endeavor to better understand a purposely traditional approach like that at Sarasota. The Verdi Cycle's very continuity, in the face of changing production values elsewhere, is an amplification of the values of the company to create a monumental but curiously ephemeral experience of Verdi's legacy in a way that feels true according to the artists responsible for the production's creation. Such strength and stubbornness may involve an unstylish conservatism, to be sure, but equally suggests an impressive resilience that ought not be taken for granted. Thank you.
Congratulations. If I understood your last point correctly, this philosophy really of authenticity and realism is actually creating something boldly new.
Terenzi actually used the word radical to describe what they've done, and I'm not actually sure he's wrong. I think it comes around, it comes full, when you've got such an orthodoxy, right? You have maybe orthodoxy on both sides, but.
Because when you stated as close as possible, to the period, you're already admitting that you're not going to get there. So what you're really doing is creating something very new by, trying to go back to.
Yeah, it's clearly asymptotic, and even this sort of rhetoric of we're doing every note he ever wrote, that's impossible, right? Based on some of the things that that Professor Gossett was saying earlier, there isn't every note, we don't have every note, we're still working on finding every note, but it's this, as we can determine where the asymptote is, and when we get there as close as we can, and you put all the resources you've got artistically, emotionally, financially into trying to get there. And it's single-minded, but it's kind of cool. In fact, that it's a small house, they can use younger singers, they can, they have sort of I don't know, they have a lot of things going for them that allow for this kind of project to happen.
August Ventura. August Ventura, did you have a question? I know you were just saying hi.
I was just saying hi. But since you pointed me out, I have to say I've seen 4 or 5
like an option,
productions at Sarasota, and you hit it with I don't know where else I felt audience warmth, because I feel like they possess this Verdi Cycle, and it's a point you made, and it's a point that needs to be reinforced. I think every opera company needs to find its niche where their core audience can say, we own this is ours. So
right, there's some kind of lesson in here maybe for artistic administrators, right, about trying to find your strengths and play to them to figure out what your company can do that other people can't, and that's not a small thing, right? That's a practical matter, but an important one. And as for the warmth aspect, I've noticed the same thing in Santa Fe, that the people who live in Santa Fe think of their opera with a lot of pride, and I think it has to do a little bit with the fact that these are towns that a lot of people come through, so the people that live there, they really own the fact that they live there, and they're proud of the institutions that make them who they are. But this is something I'll have to look into more, because it's a really interesting question.
In Casa? Corey?
Yeah. Well, actually, you just started answering the question I was going to ask, and was whether, and I don't know whether you have anything else to say about that, but whether you could say something about what does it mean for this to happen in that particular place, and in particular, you mentioned the conservatism of this kind of radical conservatism, and be interested if you could tease out a little bit what other aspects of that particular geographical.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would blame Florida necessarily. I'm not sure that I would blame Florida, because Florida is a politically sort of a problematic place. I was making a joke, but I don't think it's just that. I think it's something to do with the fact that it's been under such consistent artistic management, which allows the same kind of aesthetic to persist. A lot of things were cited to me, including the fact that it is a relatively small house. They own their own house, so they can take certain risks because of that. They don't have to, they're not sort of constantly scrimping for things. They've got a great donor base. They do stuff on budget when they can. They're not I think they've got a really good sense of their own capabilities, and it's maybe they're not as ambitious in some ways as other companies because they're aware of that, those limitations, but then they do, I don't know, they've got a really, really long view, right? Their long view is very ambitious, and that is allowed by the fact that they're short-term ambitions. If you think about some of the things that are happening in orchestras and opera companies that are going belly up right now, you can see that this is another way to do it, right? That maybe long-term has some. They did take a hit in 2008, but they got through it, right? For instance,
so sorry, just
go ahead. No.
Do you think there's a political element that could be?
I don't. I don't think so. I think that everybody seems, like just normal music people to me.
Yeah, I don't think it's political in the sense of party politics, but in the sense of what does it mean for Sarasota? You suggested it might teach something to musicology. What does it mean for?
Well, I guess I'm being a little cheeky, but I think there are competing orthodoxies about staging, and that this is sort of the other side of it, right, compared to the one that we hear from sort of more often when we're talking about productions. And I think there's often sort of a straw man thing about, the traditional, the conservative, the conventional, and that may all of those adjectives may be appropriate for these productions. I'm not denying that, but that it's really worth understanding what it is, why it is that those productions are done that way, and rather than just thinking of them as, old and dead and done, right? And I think that in general about opera, right, that sometimes conservative can be interesting, it can be useful, stuff like that, yeah. Corey,
well, it's actually, if I may, it's not really a question, I just wanted to sort of,
please,
amplify one of the strands that you brought up, which is, I think, when people start, by the way, I think Sarasota Opera is a fantastic company, especially in the emphasis they give to musical values, which is quite unique among regional American opera companies, I feel. But when people start talking about authentically doing productions, just from a dramaturgical standpoint, we get to a slippery slope. Because, for instance, you can say, for instance, I know when we were doing a lot of Handel operas while I was at New York City Opera, people would say, well, I'm really disappointed because, you did that modern dress and I wanted to see an authentic Handel production. And I had to convince people that in Handel's day, Giulio Cesare wasn't running around in a toga.
Sure.
It was like,
Right, these authenticities are always imagined also, so with something,
but also,
yeah.
I think with Verdi in particular, even though you think, 19th century melodrama, it's all pretty much face value, but even if you take a work, for instance, like Traviata, which he, he was in that time in his career when he was thinking he wanted contemporary drama, And so when he said, very famously in his letter to, I can't remember who, but that, it's a story for our time.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And so does that mean that, Traviata always has to be set in 1853, or does it mean that maybe we should set Traviata in our own time? I mean,
Right, well, I guess the issue is not with that as an alternative, but the use of should, right? That I think that a lot of people don't set Traviata in the time that it was originally set. A lot of people, maybe probably still a lot of productions do, and that both approaches are sort of articulating a different sets of values.
Yeah.
And so I guess, I know that Maestro Di Renzi would say, yeah, nobody should do anything other than what I do, but he's not here. He's down in Sarasota celebrating Verdi's birthday. And although I told him that I wouldn't put anything in the paper, which was him criticizing other companies, he did do a lot of that, right? He does have really strong opinions about what other people do, and if he were king of the world, there would be a lot of things that would be different. But, I'm not in charge of any opera company, so I'm not going to change the way that people do things. I just think it's really worth understanding how something like this happens and maybe why.
There's Catherine Williams, and then Marianne Smart. Is there any other question for time management? No? Okay, so we take this two.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting thing. I just have a bit of a question about the aesthetic standpoint, because completely interesting to complete a cycle like that.
I know, right?
Over 30 years.
Yeah, almost. By the time they finish, it'll almost be 30.
That seems like an awfully long time to have the same aesthetic standpoint. And you showed the costumes, and it is sort of coherent. And I just wonder if there's anything limiting about imposing
Oh, sure.
standpoint.
All kinds of limits. All the limits are imposed. Absolutely. And I mean, it's also possible that the people that are involved with it would acknowledge all those limits and say, yeah, there's a lot of stuff we don't do. And sometimes there are practical reasons why, and sometimes there are aesthetic reasons why.
And yet,
it's just that
you still think it's a valuable exercise to do.
I'm not saying at all that I think that doing this 30-year cycle of Verdi's operas is or is not a valuable exercise. I'm saying that looking at it is a really valuable musicological exercise because it's so weird, right? I mean, it's really unique, and when something weird and unique happens, it demands our attention, whether or not it seems to be revolutionary, revolutionary in the sense that we're often thinking of productions as revolutionary or revisionist. I don't know.
Okay,
yeah.
Mine's not a question either, it's more of a comment, but sort of a slight spin or ornament on this whole thing about what musicologists could learn from this.
Sure.
And you were, in spite of being extremely open-minded at the end of the paper, you were also sort of rotating this. There was a circle with the opposite side of the circle being radical or traditional.
Sure.
And you were sort of rotating and saying, well, the traditional might be radical. I'm wondering if there's a way of getting away from that, and getting rid of the should entirely, and thinking that what we really could learn from this is something about regional opera, and performance practice. I mean, there's all this interest in opera performance, and especially staging, visual and conceptual aspects. It always focuses on big cities like
Absolutely.
sometimes New York, and if looking to regional companies, which I know some people are talking about doing or beginning to do, you would find out a lot more, I think, about a set of habits and sort of entrainment, things that large numbers of not huge star big name singers are taught to do. And you might learn something more about what operatic practice is.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that we end up with a really skewed view of things if you only look at the top 5% of things happening. And I think we're lucky to still have, despite all of the many pronouncements of opera's death, there is a lot of opera happening in this country and other countries that's not happening live in HD, but actually live and actually in HD, like in front of you, in a lot of interesting places. And I've started telling people, and this is this is one of these things. Like I hope it's a fulfilling prophecy by telling people it becomes true that I'm interested in doing a project about American opera festivals. That would be an interesting thing to study. They think of this as festival opera, not regional opera. They actually corrected me when I called it regional opera, and it's an interesting semantic distinction because it implies you know, that because they do import a lot of people for it, and just for that 2 months. But yeah,
all regional opera companies.
I guess that's true, but so like the Portland Opera, I'm from Oregon, so I just know the Portland Opera is a regional opera company. The people who play in the pit orchestra are from Portland. They are the freelancers in Portland. Sarasota, my brother happens to play bassoon in Sarasota Opera Orchestra. That's how I found out about this project, because I'm not a Verdian, generally speaking, but he plays in that orchestra and he lives in Boston. So it's, they bring in people from all over. Obviously, I think the singers are mostly auditioned in New York, so they have a different idea of themselves than just like, you know, it's Florida's opera company or something. But it's these distinctions are interesting too. And as to the sort of, you know, musicological rotation or whatever, I think I do have to be a little bit careful, because I think there's I think whenever you use these sort of political words to talk about aesthetics, you can sometimes get into trouble. I mean, conservative, it doesn't mean that they're all Republicans, right? Traditional, you know, implies that there's sort of one thing to which we can refer back to, and all of these terms end up being very, very loaded, and that's how you end up getting. When I described them as conservative, for instance, they corrected me and said, no, it's traditional. So it's clear that they have a very clear semantic identity themselves, and it's difficult to know quite how much to represent what they're saying about themselves very truthfully. I mean, it's an ethnomusicological problem, right? Versus trying to put my own spin on it or try to figure out what it all means. But thank you very much for listening.